Hello, everyone. Good morning and welcome to Grand Rounds this morning. I hope you're all staying safe on this very snowy Friday. As you can see, I am not Dr. Schnapp. My name is Amy Zielinski. I'm the Director of Education, Innovation, and Scholarship for the department. And I'm also an associate professor in general internal medicine, where I study empathy and communication in healthcare. So, as you can imagine, I am just overjoyed to introduce our Grand Round speaker today. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Dominique Brossard, professor in the Department of Life Sciences Communication here at UW-Madison. She's also a principal investigator at the Morgridge Center for Research and an affiliate of several UW institutes, including the Holt Center for Science and Technology Studies, the Energy Institute, the Global Health Institute, and the Nelson Institute for Environmental Studies. Dr. Brossard is an internationally recognized expert on science communication, focusing on how media, policy, and public opinion intersect, especially around controversial scientific issues. I'm sure she is very busy these days. She co-directs the Science Communication Incubator Lab and has published over 150 articles in leading journals such as Science and the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. Her work has earned multiple top 1% highly cited paper distinctions. As a fellow of both the AAAS and the International Communication Association, she has served extensively on national and international boards, including the National Academies and the NSF. With a background spanning plant biology, corporate change management, and strategic communication, Dr. Brossard brings a unique interdisciplinary perspective to her teaching and her research. So please join me in welcoming our guest, Dr. Dominique Brossard.
Well, thank you, Amy. I mean, I'm going to hire you to rewrite my bio because it sounds great. I mean, thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here today to talk about something that really is close to my heart, which is the science and science communication, and particularly share what are the challenges that we face today as we try to communicate science in complex environment, and that what are the opportunities for all of us as we do so. So hopefully we will time for a lively discussion. I'm very excited to hear what you all have to say about this topic. But before getting started, I'd like to emphasize something that very often is not clear because science communication as a term, to some extent, I would say it's like medicine. It involves, on the one hand, practitioners of science communication, and on the other hand, also researchers that actually, explore what the empirical foundation for what we call the science of science communication. So that field, if you wish, of scientific inquiry is relatively new. It builds on communication sciences, political sciences, sociology, social psychology, and psychology. And it came to the attention to the National Academy of Science, I would say, roughly 10 years ago when they hosted the first, big colloquium on the science communication, realized there was so much interest by a lot of people to hear more about this that did a special issue on PNS, followed by a second one, and a third one, and so on and so forth, and leading to actually a report in the National Academy of Science Engineering consensus study called it Communicating Science Effectively, like I think 6 or 7 years ago. And more recently, we actually wrote an handbook of the science of science communication. Happy to share any of these resources if people are interested in reading more of the scholarly work, but just to give you an idea where we are today. So a lot of social scientific inquiry, a lot of, findings, but also practitioners that struggle in very different ways to make sure they can communicate with different publics in a very effective way. So what are those challenges? And what are the opportunities for professionals in general and in the medical field in particular related to this science communication field? So first of all, something that all of us are aware but impacts more particularly people that are in the business of communicating science is that information climate, that means that embed all of us, has really changed in general and also in particular for science communication. What do I mean? When I think about science, I'm thinking labs and so on in the medical fields and elsewhere where findings are, following strict methodology before being published, peer review, and so on. So we used to have what we call trusted translators of science, and here actually a lot of white males, unfortunately, but at that time that was the reality. The Washington Post, the New York Times, USA Today, and so on, very gifted science writers that were what we call the trusted translator of science for the general public to find out what was going on, let's say, in the laboratory and the scientific inquiry realm. I'm not talking about scientific conference and so on and so forth. I'm talking really for the public consumption of science. So this has changed, and now there's a direct relationship with between society at large and science, maybe by scientists themselves, people like us, you, me, Amy, and so on, that actually are, if we want to actually be on Facebook, Twitter, X, LinkedIn, and so on, we can communicate directly, but more importantly, also audiences themselves doing their own research. And I think that's been particularly challenging potentially for the medical field. People come equipped with knowledge they have gleaned through the internet, and very often, as we say in my field, it feels like Google has more power than some professional science communicators in informing the public about what's going on. A new challenge right now that my lab is also investigating is the new use of AI for communication science. And we have done a research recently that showed that close to 30% of the American public now, turn to ChatGPT to ask questions about science and so on. With obviously challenges such as hallucinations, and so on and so forth. Maybe that could be a theme for another ground rounds, focusing just on communication and AI in the context of science. I'm not going to elaborate now, but certainly a big challenge that we need to acknowledge. So the communication environment has changed, with online and social media being the new news source, if you wish, without those translators, trusted translators, that were going through a lot of gatekeeping exercises to make sure that the information was vetted, that expert were sources and sources were actually credible and trustworthy, and so on. So really, with the additional challenge, if you wish, that when we talk about social media, it's changing as we speak. New social media platforms created, left and right. You must have heard that Australia has banned the use of social media for kids younger than 16, but in the meantime, other online platforms are getting developed to allow those kids to actually reach out and connect with their friends somewhere else. So this is something that's challenging. As you well know, regulation and policy is complex in the context of social media platform. So again, I'm not going to go in detail in this, but it's a challenge that we need to realize is there. So first, that information climate that develops and that is, really changing as we speak. And second, the other thing that we need to take into account is that science, and scientific finding very often are, developing faster than the ability of science society to deal with them. So let's think about CRISPR-Cas9, for example, and the use of gene therapy, human gene editing, and synthetic biology, and so on and so forth, and so many new technology where, the ethical consideration come very often to the forefront of scientific debates, but there's really no, let's say, policy that allow us to take into account those challenges in a way that protects the public. And what we know from research is that the public is actually concerned about that. And we have found again and again that novel and non-technology bring concerns about societal impacts about the public. And here, to give you some examples of that, if you look at nuclear energy, and apologies, these are different technologies that may not have anything to do with the medical realm, or maybe, you see that actually when we ask the public from 1 to 10, how much they agree or disagree about, these concerns, moving too fast, potential unintended consequences, conflict with moral and religious view, blurring line with God and man, which is very often what happens when we actually tamper with the very small gene technology. When you go towards nanotechnology, for example, you can see like on the right, the conflict with more religious values, blurring line between God and man are bringing more concern about the public, and synthetic biology even more. So as we move toward the medical realm, the small and so on and so forth, new technologies that might actually help us reach, like something that would be really helpful for society, you can see that within the public consciousness, there's also that underlying concern that it conflicts with moral values, blurring line between God and man and so on. Things that have nothing to do with scientific realm, really. It's like much more about moral values that are coming to the forefront of people's mind. So that's something that it's important for us to think about as we think about, science communication and the challenges. So those ethical, moral considerations that very often are the issue when we think about communicated science. The other thing that is really important for all of us, and you, I'm sure, are very aware of that, but I need to remind all of us to think about very carefully, is that idea that overall, there's still a myth there that more information or explaining the science is the key to misinformed public. And you can see that I put, little signs around explaining the science and misinform the public, because it's really that idea that scientists are there, the public are there, and we can actually, to some extent, send that information that correct something. Well, decades of research in the field of science communication has shown that actually knowing more about an issue, understanding the science, does not mean that people will always change their attitude and behavior, unfortunately. And so this is obviously something that we've seen again and again, because most of the time, people do not use knowledge or understanding. People use mental shortcuts when forming judgment. Right now, I'm turning towards my window. I see the snow is falling, and I'm like, the mental shortcut is going to be very hard to drive. Well, actually, I haven't looked exactly at, the weather report. I haven't looked at the information seen if my street had been, already with a snow plower, if actually maybe it's really clean there. Maybe I can go to work. But my mental shortcut tells me it's actually falling really, really fast. And by the way, the snowplower hasn't come yet, but that's another issue. So using those mental shortcuts to form judgments is very often what people do in a lot of realms, and even including, medical decisions where something that may be related to a moral value, a trust issue, and so on will come to play. But that whole idea of science, medical literacy being the main determinant of people attitudes toward what I call new science is very much alive, and it has different labels in my field, being called knowledge deficit model, science literacy model, the familiarity hypothesis, and so on and so on. They still have that assumption we need to inform people. If we inform it better, if we explain the science better, we will be better off. And very often, if it's not, let's say, the doctor, it's the media that's blame, and so on and so forth. That idea of the communication, effective communication, is about explaining the science better, as we, I'm sure, all realize, is very often not the only explanation. But this has led the Academy of Science, Engineering, and Medicine in 2016 to actually ask for a consensus report. I was actually very delighted to be part of the group of people that looked at the extensive literature on science literacy and medical literacy, and their relationship with public perception of science and behaviors related to health. In some, what does science tell us about that potential relationship? And more specifically, what's the evidence of science literacy and support for attitude, perception of scientific research, and health-related behaviors? So what the conclusion of this National Academy report, putting together, I would say at least 2 decades of social science research, exploring a lot of context in health, environment, and so on, that there was little support for the science literacy deficit model. So information matters in different ways for different groups. And a lot of you in this room who are used potentially to actually talk one-on-one with patients and so on, you know that very well. You know that some things that you explain to one patient not be perceived the same way, but another patient. But this is tricky, and this is definitely a challenge when we want to do communication to groups and communication that, like that, address issues of public health, address issue at the societal level. Let's think vaccines, for example, to actually use an example that's very much in everybody's mind as I give this talk today. So what does impact public attitude toward new science, and in relationship to that, their potential behavior towards a lot of issues in health context and elsewhere? Well, obviously, it's the individual itself. I mean, like all of us, we carry baggage, we have different attitudes, different background, different education, and so on and so forth, that will color how we feel about new science. But second one, more importantly, is the media environment. And when I talk about the media environment, it's not only, newspapers and so on and so forth, is also, marketing messages, films, and so on and so forth, that will color what we feel using some filters that I'm going to talk about in a second. And most importantly, that's something that we don't always think, is the culture itself will, color how we feel about new science. So I'm actually, my parents are French, but I grew up in South America. I was born in Argentina, and I'm an American citizen. Actually, United States is the country I spent most of my life. I've been here for close to 30 years. And I mean, acutely aware of how the culture, the institution, the policy are very often the main predominant influence on how people feel about science issue. And as a matter of fact, this led me to actually go for a communication degree, Cornell University, on the science of science communication. It tried to disentangle this relationship using mainly quantitative models to actually parse out what's due to individual, what's due to media, what's due to those culture, those institutions and policy. So I won't go in the detail of what we call that social, political, cultural context, just, let you know that it includes religion, it includes institutional context and policy, it includes socioeconomic context. But just by doing that, I'm sure you realize that, even within Wisconsin, if we think about, let's say Vilas County and Dane County, the socioeconomic context is different, and that will color how people feel about the issue. We even within Dane County, we think about Madison versus, 50 miles from here outside of Madison. It really colors how people feel because the context, the cultural context is already different. So I'm going to move more towards the information climate for just 1 second and remind you that when I think information climate, like I was telling you a few seconds ago, I'm including not only media and social media coverage, but also marketing messages, what we see in those boxes we buy at supermarket, science fiction film, what they tell us about genetic technology, educational messages that we see, in college and so on. So the media coverage is just only one part of what I called the information climate. But remember that I told you that actually that knowledge deficit model is really not what explains most public attitude towards science. And just to give you an idea, as applied to media coverage and those shortcuts that we use to make sense of things, these are examples that are linked to gene technology. And you can see that here, those are visuals that have been used by a lot of campaigns. In the top, you can see this is Greenpeace, like using Frankenfood as a term to actually make people wary of food containing GMOs. So as you can see, that has nothing to do with understanding genetically engineered, but actually everybody can relate to Frankenstein, which triggers right away an alarm and makes people worry without actually even going further. On the bottom, obviously, that whole like apple with a syringe. People do not like syringe. People, right away are like, oh my God, this is something bad. And on the left corner, you can see the caterpillar for the monarch butterfly. A few years back, there was a study that kind of suggested that consuming genetic engineered corn was hurting the monarch butterfly. So monarch butterfly being a beloved, actually, insect in United States wouldn't have any cultural resonance in France, for example. So those cultural, aspects used to actually give some ground to those mental shortcuts. Frankenfood also wouldn't have any connection in other culture and so on and so forth. So those common elements that actually are used as potential filters exist in the media. And those are in the headlines, in the visuals, in the metaphors, in the sources that are used in a media article. And I always tell my fellow scientists, please, if you have anybody, social media bloggers or journalists that contact you, yes, say yes. Because if you're not the source, somebody else will be the source. And this is one of the potential, shortcuts that people use to make sense of what's in an article. This is actually an image that was in The Scientist, which is a great magazine, in the life sciences. It was in 2014. I'll use it again and again in a lot of settings, because this was actually a article that explained how genetic engineer could help keep harmful toxic after barley and potentially make beer more palatable and more healthy, if you wish. But unfortunately, the visual that was used by the magazine was, people actually wanting DNA. So the problem, though, and I showed again and again this graphic in different settings, people were worried about the article even before reading it because of the visual. The visual actually predisposed people to have a negative attitude toward the content with something that we know very well in communication science, that whole process of priming. So visuals, are extremely important to think about and do like research to make sure we know how people will react to them. Something that I find funny may be actually very alarming to someone else. Something that Amy finds particularly educational may be completely out of place with another group, as Amy knows very well, obviously. So those media frames are very important. And as I told you before, they do not operate in a vacuum because we use mental shortcut to make sense of them. So imagine you're in a museum and you see a great piece of art. Well, that piece of art has a specific frame. It could be a metallic frame, very modern and so on. But imagine now that you're in another setting and that piece of art has an elaborated golden, integrate antique framing. You're not gonna react to the art the same way depending on the frame. So this is why framing as a theory has been applied to communication research and showing how the same information will be perceived very different by different people depending how it's framed. And the one that you may know about is what we call the loss and gain frame. If we actually frame things in terms of loss, people react very differently than if we actually, framing in terms of gain. Let's say, if you have 6 people that die among 10 people, it's going to be more alarming than if 4 people survive among 10 people. We tend to actually, the bad example, 5 people die, 5 people survive. If we say 5 people die versus 5 people survive, people actually tend to actually give more weight to negative information. And that's just an example of framing that actually got, first is Kahneman, the Nobel Prize a long time ago, applied in finances and so on and so forth. So audiences process frame and information through different filters. And what my colleagues and I in different settings have shown that very often religious beliefs is the first field that they use in the context of science, applied in medical field, and so on, that touch the very small. It could be also like the moral schema, like ethics that they think may be a problem. It could be deference to scientific authority and so on. As a result, and that's really something that we have as communication scientists and professionals have to really disentangle for every communication effort we make, is that any given frame may mean different things to different people because they will use different filters in different settings applied to each and different issue. So what impacts people toward a new science? Once, let's say, we're going to embark in a communication exercise, we understand the social, political, and cultural context of that group we're going to talk to. We have an idea of the information climate they are embedded to. What do they read? What kind of social media platform? Who do they trust? Who are the opinion leaders? We can actually turn to individual level characteristic and see, so what are the things we need to think about when we talk to them about new science? Well, in a nutshell, going back and being actually consistent, what I was telling you at the beginning of this talk, that, that deficit knowledge idea, we call publics, because there's no one general public, there's different public in different settings, depending this cultural, institutional, political context. We call them low information public, because a general rule, you, me, everybody, we do not like to think all the time. We like to actually use as little cognitive process as we can to be able to make sense of things around us, because there's so much stuff happening. So we call that low information public. Make sense of information to different public. And if I had to actually summarize, let's say, communication 101, without even thinking, what we think is, how much information do I need to decide? You may have decided at the beginning of this talk, based on Amy's really amazing bio that she gave it for me, that, okay, I'm going to listen to her. Or maybe you will decided this is not going to be worth of my time because there's no accreditation for this talk. My fault, by the way, because I didn't take care of things before. Like, it's not the Department of Medicine issue here. How much information I need to decide? So obviously we don't formulate that question in our mind, but based on those mental shortcuts, we decide right away. For example, when somebody comes for an interview for a job, the appearance of the person, the how they are dressed, their shoes, their dress, and so on, how they handle themselves, has already given the interviewer a cue of how to actually judge this person very often. Very often the decision to be positive or negative towards someone that we're going to interview for a job is made in the first 5 minutes. How much information do I need to decide? Second, how do media around me interpret and decide me? This is a way to actually translate in plain language what I was telling you about media framing and so on and so forth, where people turn towards like things they used to look at. So let's say, the vaccine issue, how do the media around me talk about this? Gives me a clue as an individual, as a lay individual, to actually form a judgment. And finally, once, people have thought about this without thinking, subconsciously, how do those interpretations fit with my beliefs and other values? And that's where those potential filters I was telling you come into place. So see, like when you think about that, that gives you to some extent a pathway towards what we need to think about when we want to communicate our science with different audiences. So those characteristics at the individual level, and I'm not going to actually go in detail in all of them. I already talked about moral consideration. And that laundry list I give you here is all, based on empirical findings that have been done in different lab settings and extremely a well-designed public opinion surveys. Political ideology, unfortunately, is very often used as a filter and may actually color how people feel about scientific issue, particularly when those issues have become polarized. Attitudes towards science and technology, also, we have a tendency to either have general attitudes or negative attitudes that can be used as a filter. Perception of risk and benefits related to the issue will color how we feel about a specific issue. Interpersonal exchanges with friends and colleagues have been shown also to be important. Trust in information providers, deference to science authority as a way of knowing and coming with the truth, if you wish, related to a scientific issue. And obviously, although I told you about that knowledge deficit, how much we know about the issue is also something to think about. So these, all these, think about as a model. If at the end you have, how do I feel about vaccine? And then you put all those, criteria I put here, you're going to have, a mix of, let's say, weight given to each of those. So what we do in my lab is for different issue, try to see which is the weight that's given to any of those different facets in different contexts. So which means, unfortunately, the bad news of the day, there's no magic bullet to communicate science. Depending on the issue, depending on the cultural, institutional, social context, one of these things will be more important than others. And once we have done some research to actually find out, that's where we would actually focus our communication efforts. It may be to actually look at the perception of risk and benefits and actually work on that. It may be to actually show people how political ideology is not related to the issue and we should actually avoid being polarized in that issue. It may be that moral consideration needs to be taken into account and that is something that will have to be part of the debate, and so on and so forth. So I'm not going to go in details, but I'm going to talk about trust though, because as all of you in this room that may be actually talking to a different public, this is a very important thing to think about. So what risk communication research has shown us is that acceptance of message is often more closely related to the perceived trustworthiness of the messenger than the content of the message itself. Let's say that, I am giving this talk to you here. You trust me because of Amy wonderful bio. You think that I'm very knowledgeable, credible, unbiased, and so on. But let's say you meet me at the corner of a bus stop and I begin blutter about science communication. You may say, she has a weird accent. I don't trust her. I'm not believing her. So the content of the message itself remains content and constant, and we've shown that again and again in different settings, but is the perceived trustworthiness of the messenger that's going to color how people, act on that message. But the good news for all of us here, as science consistently outperforms other institutions' considered knowledge. You may have heard a lot of, things about, there is a debacle for trust in science, science is under attack and so on, which may be true at the institutional context, political context, but at the heart of the matter for all the Americans, the trust in institutes in general have going down the tube since COVID. Look here, medical scientists, look at the last column, December 2021, not too much trust on the medical scientists. December 21 was 22% of people would say that, versus in June 2016 was 15%. Well, look at religious, at the military. 25% didn't trust the military in 2021. Look at the religious leaders, 45% looking at the elective policy. So basically, trust in institutions in general have going down since COVID. So I think we need to be really careful about this, that rhetoric about, there is a war on science. There may be different, settings, fundings, and so on and so forth. But as far as the American public as a whole, as a matter of fact, confidence in scientists to work in the best interest of the people is finally a little bit on the rise. You can see on October 23rd, 2023, it was down to 27% of people not trusting scientists. But in the October 24, it seems to be going back again. Again, it's an empirical question. Will that continue to rise? But we need to be, very cognizant to the fact that trust in institutions in general, and this is problematic, obviously, for all of us that want to help public health and, for the public good, making sure that people get the information they need to make good judgments. But unfortunately, it's trust in institution in general that is going down the tube. But people overall value and rely on science. This is a recent survey in May 2025 that was done by the Association of Science and Technology Centers, which showed that 7 in 10 respondents say that science benefits, people like me. Oh, I mean, the downside here is that you had 20% that did not really aware, but only 8% really disagree with that. Medical research and innovation benefit people like me. 73%, agree with that. And on the other side, 7%. And this is always, if you think of a normal curve, we always have people very positive, people very negative. It's already around 7 or 8%. Climate denialist, actually, 7, 8%. So here, like those 20% of people that don't really know should be the people we focus on. Medical research and innovation benefit people like me. Those 20% are not sure. Maybe the one we need to reach to actually show them how, this is something that's done for the best interest in mind. But also the good news that overall Americans trust their doctors and medical scientists. This is a research from a year ago, and we need to get more data here by, sorry, this went too fast, by KFA, the Kaiser Foundation. That's a great source of health information and trust. And you could see that here, 85% of Americans trusted their doctors to make the right recommendation to come to health issues. And this runs with across partisan line, although slightly more Democrats, 92%, and independent, trusted their doctors. However, the more important thing that I wanted to remind you is that still you're going to see that knowledge, that discourse out there saying there is, a crisis in trust in science. Actually lead myself and colleagues to actually write an article in the American Scientist addressing that idea to keep on saying that the American public does not trust science is not helpful, because it's like saying they're wrong and we're right. So we need to move outside of this kind of discourse. The problem though is science is viewed more and more partisan. When I say partisan, I mean either Democrat or Republican. Science is obviously political. The decision of fund science or not and so on are political decisions. There's policies. But what we don't want is to think that science is either Democrat or Republican. Science should be bipartisan. And Americans are divided over the role of science in scientific policy debate. As you can see here, 51% of American adults believe that scientists should take an active role in public policy, but 48% think they should focus on sound scientific fact and stay out of policy debates. So the mix of science and policy does not go really well with science. And then actually the problem is that when we say stuff like follow the science, this has actually translated into this follow the science is a democratic thing. And I mean, colleagues and I have actually claimed that the term follow the science, it kind of political leaders kind of say, no, follow the policies, and science is part of the data that we use to make policy. Science by itself does not determine policy. That's a political decision, and it has backfired to use that thing. So I'm going to actually wrap up very soon because I want to leave time for questions. But more importantly, it's interesting to see that in the recent study I was mentioning, only a small part of the respondents had an awareness of the federal policy change and impact in science. I mean, like funding to NIH and so on and so on. 23% had not heard about it. 62% had kind of vaguely heard, didn't know the specific, and only 15% could share, specifics. So that's our goal, to actually do a better job, communicate about the funding and how our labs work and so on and so forth, because overall the American public is not aware. I mean, sadly also, it's like the research scientist traits included honestly in the house now translating the political realm, where, Republican Democrats feeling differently about scientists. Look at the question on focus on solving real world problems, as our medical scientists are doing. 52% of Republicans think so, when 72% of Democrats. But then, more actually problematic, the question of feel superior to others. you look at how the Democrats and the Republicans really actually differ on thinking about that. So why is that? So this is really something that we need to be careful when we communicate our science, not be perceived as partisan. So the key insight, as I was telling you, that the perceived trustworthiness of the messengers is more important than the content of the message itself. And science do not always have to be the messengers. So it could be, yes, the doctors are trusted, and the doctors in their practice are the people are turning to actually make decisions about their health. But in the public realm, it may be an opinion leader that actually much more trusted by the community that should be our voice. He may be the religious leader, the business leaders, and so on and so forth. So if people such as us, the scientists, actually venture in public realm outside of the medical practice, we need to be trained well and take into account people's values and concerns. So I could just encourage everyone to enhance their applied science communication skills. And very often what we hear is like, oh, use accessible language, replace jargon with clear explanation. But I would actually argue that what you need to do is get more insight from the science of science communication. I try to give you some pointers and social psychology one-on-one on how people make sense of science to actually give you a starting point. But I mean, there's a lot of different workshops and so on that explore that more in depth and gives access to this type of training. I'll be happy to send things your way if you're interested. And more importantly, too, is show transparent method, show how science works and evolve. The picture I have here is Brad Schwartz, who is the CEO of the Mortgage Institute for Research. We organized, some training at the Public Library of Mount Horeb, where we explained stem cell research and so on. And, and he was very frank into showing and explaining how the cuts of NIH and so on were impacting the medical labs that do research at the Mortgage Institute. So like transparent, show science works and evolve, explaining the scientific process is something, unfortunately, that science education has not done very well at the high school level. And I would also tell you if you want to leverage modern platform, engage on YouTube and Instagram, do so by being aware of the pitfall and making sure that you not actually run against people's values and concerns, because we can actually make things worse even if we mean well. So know your goal and actually trust that you can do it by relying on insight from the science and science communication. There's actually an open access book, Science Communication for Scientists, that came up from several of my colleagues. Todd Newman is actually in the Department of Life Science Communication. It's open access, so I'll be happy to send the link also to go more in detail with whatever I shared today. So last but not least, in the last 3 minutes I gave myself, we need to understand the psychology of risk communication, because what's interesting is that the risks that kill people the most and the risks that upset people the most are often unrelated. So look at vaccine, for example. Obviously, the vast majority of Americans actually trust vaccines. I mean, we see it a decline, but overall, people get vaccinated and trust their doctors and so on and so forth. But those that get upset about their potential impact on our lives is not linked to the hazard itself. It's not like this, like the amount of potential, negative impact a vaccine has. Is the outrage that vaccine may have. So when we tell a mother, let's say that there's one chance out of 1 million that her baby will get side effects of a vaccine, that's a very small hazard. But the outrage is big, because the mother may think, what about if my baby is that one? So the outrage is what we need to understand. And it may be linked to trust. It may be linked of how, pharmaceutical companies are perceived and so on and so forth and so forth. Going back to what I was telling you, but laundry list of criteria that determine how people feel about the science issue. And the perceived benefit of no benefit are equally important. In the vaccine issue, for example, and fortunately, we have a lot of diseases that have been eradicated for vaccines, but unfortunately, people do not see that because those diseases are not there anymore. So it's the perception of lack of benefits are almost as important as the perception of risk issue. So correcting misinformation for science issues may be missing the point. And what's more important is understand how people find that information. And I wrote an article with a colleague in the PNAS, Proceed of National Academy of Science, talking about what being science literate doesn't mean actually knowledge about the science. Is know what information can you trust and how is it trustworthy in a digital world. And I can send that way to everyone if you want. It's also part of a special issue of me and PNAS on misinformation and the public. So longer term, we are trying to build bridges between research, policy, and education, the high school level, for, like the next generation to be aware of science, work, and process more than actually being knowing of the scientific facts. So in a nutshell, if I had to summarize what I told you, social science research matters. Unfortunately, there's no magic bullet. Each target audience will have value, motivation, perceptions, and of risk, benefits, and so on, that which evolve with societal development. That's why we partner with a lot of different institutions to help them actually understand their audience. Second phrase matter, I told you, like any information will be perceived differently. And so we need to understand how they resonate with audience in either context. And trust matters and it's critical. But however, as we say very often in my field, trust is very hard to build, but it's very easy to destroy. And as soon as we don't listen and we don't take into account people's concern, we can destroy that trust. So we shouldn't take it for granted. So the problem is not the science that we have or how we communicate it, but it's the way we describe it. And there's relevant stories that can connect to people's mind, to give them a way to actually trigger, some mental shortcut that will go in the direction we want to do. And only with true research, we can find that. So audience different their views about issue. We need to take in terms of issue publics. Like say people that are wary of vaccine right now may be very willing to actually having a good diet and so on and so forth. We actually have to make sure we don't put everybody on the same basket. So crisis can be anticipated. That's what we're trying to do right now and have some communication process to do so. But as I'm 2 minutes late, apologies, I'd like to have 15 minutes for questions. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Dr. Brossard. That was so informative and brought up a lot of questions I know for myself. So as people formulate their own questions and type them into the Q&A box, I'm going to start with one of mine. You touched on this a little bit, and I think, in our environment, COVID-19 definitely changed a lot in the medical field and even in the crisis moment of it and then going forward. So in your world and with your colleagues, how did you see that event and how do you think that that has changed if it has the way that we communicate with the public? How did that was that a point of turning or was that just kind of something that happened and the trends were there already?
No, that's such a great question, Amy. And actually, we wrote with Todd Newman and a student. We wrote a piece on the conversation. Exactly, if you're aware of the conversation, exactly about this topic, and I'll be happy to send it your way. So it was a turning point, and I remember I was one of the risk comic experts for COVID, that was put forward by UW-Madison in 2020, early 2020. And I remember vividly talking to a medical journalist. And I was saying, I just hope that COVID-19 is not going to become a politicized issue and it's not going to become polarizing people, because then we're going to have the same communication mess that we have with climate change. And unfortunately, that happened. We had a very contested election, that happened. It became very polarizing, like all the medical advice that were given, social distancing, masking, and so on, became equated with political ideology. This was a turning point with medical issues. It was really a turning point for health communication in a way that we hadn't seen before. So health communication usually, apart from, okay, vaccines have been, vaccine hesitancy has been an issue, but it was across the political aisle. We had people, extremely liberal people in California, and extremely conservative people somewhere else that were hesitant for different reasons. But he wasn't political as well. So you're right. COVID-19 was a turning point, and the disaster of communication that happened with it. Because like the instead of presenting science in an ever evolving field, he said, if I had to give advice to any, to like the CDC at that time, which we did afterwards, too late, it was say, we are proposing, policy with the best science knowledge we have at this point. As soon as science come up with other things as this crisis unfold, we may actually change the policy. But right now, based on the knowledge we have, this is what we do. Instead of doing that, we said, oh yes, fabric masks work. Oh no, they don't. Oh yes, N95. Oh yes, no. Which, by the way, completely discredited all the communication exercise. So a turning point.
Yeah, that's so, yeah. I remember those days as well.
Right?
Just whiplash and just not knowing what, because we didn't
Exactly.
know. Nobody knew.
Nobody knows.
Yeah.
So follow the science, unfortunately, was a bad slogan because science was doing the best they could, all those scientists trying. But the policies were like, where are the policies?
Yeah, absolutely. We have a question coming in. Thanks for the masterful presentation. What's the role of story and anecdote to enhance trustworthiness?
This is such a good question. I don't know who asked it, but I give a lot of talks as a university public speaker bureau, and I have actually, even though I have the research to back it up, very often at the beginning when I was a young assistant professor, I forgot that actually I needed to perceive as a person before being perceived as a scientist. So, like going and establishing trust with the audience, it may be as a fellow mother, as a fellow Wisconsinite that like the Badgers and that is really sad of like a Packers that lost. And, as build that bridge to build warmth and be actually those anecdotes that actually are going to build a rapport. And I think, like anybody that is in the medical field and has that one-on-one rapport with the patients can relate to that, right? People trust you not because you're a grumpy old man, but because you're one person that listens to them and actually is willing to listen. So anecdotes can do that. Anecdotes about yourself, but that anecdotes about, stories that actually paint, like a real person in people's mind. So you're not going to say 8 out of 10 Americans should get vaccinated. You say, like Amy, mother, I don't know if you're a mother, sorry. Amy, mother of 3 kids, had all her kids vaccinated and realized blah, 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 because they can send them to school with confidence that not only they're protected, but the other classmates and la, 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 la. So this is a great point. So when I was saying we need to tell relevant stories, build on the anecdote to build that rapport. And actually, news writing from good journalists always start by that. We start by the human interest intro, and then you're going to go to what we call, if it's a good article, to something that's not anecdotal, but it's more like painting a big picture. So anecdotes are very useful.
Yeah, that's great. And it reminds me of another question that I had. You mentioned sort of the journalists used to be the trusted translators of science, and now it's sort of direct scientists to the public. And now we have AI. How do you imagine that that's going to transpire over time? Who is going to be those trusted translators in the next 10, 15 years?
Well, this is a. I wish I had like a crystal ball to give you the answer, Amy. I know that we're battling very much like people like I to, have strong regulations for AI. We are very concerned. I have a student, actually, I wasn't her advisor, but I was in her committee that did a study on AI hallucination and using medical context and also environmental context and so on. And she made big AI models talk to each other, try to understand when they make up stuff. When you actually put those so big models in a context where they feel there's controversy and the science is not clear, they invent, and that's what we call hallucination. They invent scientific record. You should see how countless of scientific articles are made up because the AI models are not trained to say I don't know. So they make up stuff. And actually, I found out in the lab, one of my students came up and said, I cannot find this article of yours. I'm like, which one? And she gave me the title. Then she went to ChatGPT to ask for like an abstract. An abstract was come up. invented, completely invented. So hopefully it's not AI, or if AI is actually used as a trusted, communicator, we have it fixed and it's based on input from people that know what they're talking about. But I do hope that all of us scientists still have a role to play in this messy environment, the future that you tell me about, Amy. And unfortunately, I do not know.
Yeah. Oh, that's fascinating and terrifying as
Yeah,
well.
it is a little terrifying.
One of the things I noticed on the graph you had about trustworthiness and institutions is that the business leader graph was pretty stable over quite
Yeah.
a long time, of a lot of trust. And I'm curious why you think that is, why the US publics maybe trust business leaders more than other people.
It's interesting because I feel that, like business leaders, goal and that, their interaction with the public is pretty constant. They not change. They are looking for profit. They're like, whatever. It's like it's clear versus all the other, institutions to some extent it's become messy. Look at COVID and so on and so forth. So actually, I do believe that partnering with business leaders, is something that could be very interesting. And I was part of it, just wrap up because of lack of funding, but of something that we call the Societal Expert Action Network. It's Sean, it's like a mouthful, from National Academy of Science, funded by NSF, where we were provided timely advice to leaders during COVID, translating social science research, into practice. And we had a workshop in September to look at very successful public health initiatives. And we had an example in California where, like some Department of Public Health, they partner with Microsoft to actually talk to like the employees and so on and so forth for public health related measures, and it was very successful. So I think when we think about partners, and what we talk about, we need to think out of the box. And it's not only our medical scientists, maybe others that may be better suited. And you point about the business here, right on target. Amy, you have the right mind. You're going to look where you can have leverage, right? And that's where we can make a difference.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, I think those partnerships, and even on campuses like ours, where our business school, where we have the department
Right.
that you're in, I think there's a lot of opportunity that we might not actually take advantage of all the time.
And Amy, it's funny that you say that because we don't even know each other very well. Like there is like that. And I know that University of Michigan, I believe, created just attached to their president chancellor, a public engagement with science bureau that actually makes those connections. And I feel like we're missing this, and hopefully there's an opportunity to do something in that realm because to find each other, right?
Yeah, exactly. I
Mm.
know. Yeah, I've met people. I know our connection was through Norma Saldivar, and I met
Exactly.
her at a conference in New
Here
York.
you
So
go.
like,
Yeah, right? It's always that we have to go to other states to reach each other. It's
exactly. I think the other question that I had that sort of pinged my interest was, people will be hesitant to engage if somebody's reaching out to them as a scientist. And I think as medical faculty as well, sometimes people are a little hesitant to engage on those platforms that maybe we're not that familiar with. And I think thinking about the science of science communication and the frameworks is great. Are there other ways that you've encouraged people to get some training or to just feel a little bit more self-efficacy around
well,
engaging in that way?
it's I think it relates to a question that you have that one of the audience member asked at the beginning is that we should not undermine or like underestimate the fact that warmth and how we perceive as people is important. And we have neighbors, we have, we go to baseball practice with our kids, we meet a lot of people, and all those encounters that actually foster trust may be an opportunity, to actually communicate. And obviously in Madison, it's like kind of like a preaching to the choir, but I think we need to think about that. You're on the plane sitting to somebody next to somebody, and you may have an opportunity. So you don't have to, but you need to remember that if you proceed as a warm and trustworthy person, you may have an opportunity to at least plant some seeds.
Yeah, I think that's such a great reminder for me personally, because often, frankly, sometimes I avoid those interactions
Right.
because I'm worried about the conflict or But I
And
do
you,
think that's the way forward.
yeah, and like you don't have, I mean, honestly, like I was thinking of a recent interaction in the plane and with the vaccine thing, and I'm like, oh, really, you feel like that? And why? And then, that person explained, I say, oh, I can see where you're coming from. I mean, that's not my experience, my doctor, this and that. You don't judge. You don't tell them to think over it otherwise. You actually just, listen and tell them, and then you plant a seed.
Yeah, it's great. We have one final comment probably from Dr. Christy Bartles that the UW Dissemination Implementation Launchpad links social science and business cases. How would you advise spreading the word about this?
Oh, this is a great point. I don't know anything about it, so I would love to actually learn more. And if you send me a link and I learn more, maybe I can give some pointers.
Yeah, that would be great. I think that it would be wonderful to have more of a connection between
Yeah,
our departments for sure.
yeah.
All right. Well, thank you so much. This was really great. And it's a great way to start off our snowy Friday.
Well, thank you so much for having me, Amy. It was a great conversation.